Hi, I'm DJ Sixsmith. You're watching The Sit Down. Stanley Nelson's here with us. Brand new documentary, ESPN 30 for 30. It's called Vick, about this guy, Michael Vick.
Yep.
Nice to meet you, sir.
Good to meet you.
How's everything going?
It's going great. Everything's going great.
So I watched this last night into today. There's so many different things to talk about. It took you guys a little while to get Michael Vick involved with this, but why did you want to tell this story? What fascinated you the most?
Well, I mean, I think, you know, as a filmmaker, what fascinated me is it's a sports story, which I was really excited to do a 30 by 30 and really do that. But it's so much more than a sports story. You know, there's so many other facets to it. It's you know, it's that rise and fall and rise again story, but it's more than that. You know, there's you know, race is involved, poverty is involved, the idea of black quarterbacks in the NFL. You know, there's so many things that we thought that we could talk about within the framework of Michael Vick's story.
I think it's really important to start with race and poverty because you guys go back to Virginia, you tell the story of Newport News, and like for people who aren't from that area, don't know that area, like there's a lot of stuff going down in that area. So why was it so important to tell that story and kind of give some context there?
Well, you know, we felt from the beginning that Newport News was kind of a character in the film. I mean, Newport News is one of those places where there's no reason to go there, you know, unless you're going there. You know, do you know it? It's like it's not on the way to anything.
Right.
It's
he calls it. Mike Vick calls it bad news, right? Yeah.
Right. Their actual kennels was called Bad News Kennels because you know they call it bad news, and you know it's kind of like off to the side. So if you're going from here to here, you got to go off that way to go to Newport News, and you know, sports was seen as the way out, you know, for so many people. You know, Allen Iverson is from that area, so many other athletes are from that area, and so that was the way out was through sports, and we wanted to tell that story. And
you guys had Iverson in the documentary, and there's some really interesting parallels between the two of them. What was most interesting when you talked to him about Vick?
You know, Iverson was just so great in the doc, you know, and we know what we know about Iverson, you know, and sometimes, you know, I think that he can be difficult, but he was just, you know, wonderful and kind of lit up, you know, when he talked about Mike and when he talked about Newport News, and both of them were from there. Both of them were kind of from, you know, semi-impoverished childhoods. You know, they both had very young mothers, and they both got out through athletics. And you know, for better or worse, Iverson was kind of an idol of Mike's. You know, and in some ways, you know, Mike, and he says it, you know, in the film, very honestly, that he, you know, looked to Iverson and copied Iverson.
You mentioned family. I mean, Mike Vick's mom was 17 when she gave birth to him. The relationship with Mike's dad wasn't great. Why was it important to tell that family part of the story, and how did that inform who Michael Vick became?
Well, that's who Michael Vick was, you know, and you know that Mike was her second child, so you know she had two kids while she was in high school, you know, and you know, and besides that, she was a loving and caring mother, and we wanted to show that, and that, you know, as Mike said, you know, he had no real mentors, you know, male mentors until he got to high school, and then it was his coaches, and those were kind of his mentors, you know, throughout his life. So that's part of Mike's story. You know, Newport News is Mike's story, how he grew up, and you know, as the story progresses, Mike's loyalty to the place and Mike's loyalty to his friends, again, for better or worse.
And I think that played a factor in going to Virginia Tech, because he could have gone to Cuse, but it wouldn't have been a part of the Michael Vick story. So when you think about Virginia Tech, what stands out to you the most about that chapter of his career?
Well, I mean, you know, one thing that's really funny is he chooses Virginia Tech because they can drive. It's 5 hours away, but it's for them. It's like, you know, further than they've ever been. So it's far. You know, you know, his aunt and mother talk about that. You know, Virginia Tech was far for them, and it becomes, you know, Mike Vick's story. He goes there. You know, he's on is a largely white campus, and he talks about that. His coaches are largely white. He says he's never been exposed really to white folks before, but he takes his friend, you know, Quantis, you know, tells this great story of you know, Mike Vick coming home, you know, to visit, and Quantis Phillips, his friend, just jumps in the car and goes and kind of lives with Mike, you know, at Virginia Tech, and that starts this kind of arrangement where they're together for the first part of Mike's career.
Yeah, that relationship's really interesting. And also the relationship between the media and the black quarterback, which you get into a lot in this film. And it starts at Virginia Tech because he's playing it differently than anyone's ever played it. He goes to the Sugar Bowl, and then Bobby Bowden says this is going to be what quarterbacks look like the next 10 years, which was really telling of what was to come. So what piqued your interest about the black quarterback in the late 90s at that point?
Well, I mean, that's one of the things that excited me, about this film and the chance to do this film was to talk about, black quarterbacks and to talk about it honestly, because a lot of times we don't talk about it. It's gotten talked about in the last year or two because of what's happening in the NFL. But, it's not kind of, something that people tackle, right up front. When I was growing up, there were no black quarterbacks.
Right.
In the NFL, and there were certain owners who said, a black man is never going to play quarterback on my team, and that was said outright. And then slowly but surely there'd be one or two in a sport that I think is something like 70-75% black. Still the quarterback position is probably, besides kicker, is probably the whitest position in the NFL. So it was a chance for us to talk about that. And, there are a couple of guys that we interviewed in the film. Bill Roden is one, and some others who talk about how if you were athletic as a quarterback, if you were athletic as a black quarterback, then, that was seen as a strike against you. So that you were pushed to being, even if you were great in college, you were pushed to being a defensive back or a receiver or a running back. And so, we talk about that in the film.
Yeah, that's Tony Dungy's story. I mean, he was a quarterback in college and he becomes a DB in the pros. I mean, what could have been for him? Or Warren Moon has to go to Canada. Like, even what Donovan McNabb said about how he described the differences in the analysis, and then you paired it with what Joe Theismann said. Like, that's it. The way that we talk about white and black quarterbacks has been the issue all along.
Right. I mean, I think Tony Dungy's bite in the film is fantastic because he talks about playing against Warren Moon. Like they play against each other in college as starting quarterbacks, and neither one of them got drafted by the NFL, and that's just the way it was. And Mike Vick kind of broke that mold because he is that style of quarterback, and he gets drafted number one, and the first time an African American quarterback gets drafted number one.
Yeah, that was huge. I mean, he smashed that mold. And for people who forget, like, he was a cultural phenomenon. Like, he was bigger than the franchise. He was the most popular player in the league by some arguments. What was it like going back to that time, like peak Vic, when he's doing his thing for the Falcons, running all over the place?
I mean, it's amazing. When you see the film, we were watching it last night, and our hearts were like, oh my
it's just
God.
unbelievable to watch.
I was watching it with my wife, and she's like, oh my God, now I see. Because a lot of times you forget with all the other things that happened with Vic, just how amazing he was and exciting he was, as a football player. And so, it's great to kind of revisit that and as we build the story to understand that, it was not just this quarterback who has this fall, but it was, as you say, probably the most popular player in the NFL, one of the highest paid athletes in the world. That's the height that he had reached.
And the other thing with Michael Vick is that for as good as he was playing, like, the work ethic wasn't still there. The relationships with his friends from home were still a problem. And there were people that were trying to talk to him, but he didn't seem like he was getting it. So as you kind of build things out, obviously the dogfighting comes into the picture, but how do you think things led to that point where it just all fell apart for him?
Well, I mean, I think that he had this. People were just being very, very, very lenient with Mike and letting him do kind of what he wanted because he was still great. It's very clear that if Mike had sat down and studied the playbook and really, had worked on his craft, he just would have been that much better. But that he didn't do that. That he surrounded himself with his friends, and his wife describes it as like a frat house. He had, like she said, there's just men on top of men living out, everywhere, around Mike, and that he kind of didn't cut that life loose. I think again. Ended up coming back on him. And I think one of the fantastic things about the film is that there's little hints of these problems.
Right, the police officers across the street at the church.
Right, people are warning him. His coach gives him some golf clubs and says, why don't you take up golf? Dan Reeves calls Qantas and tries to talk to Mike's friends and say, you got to help this guy and not hurt him. But Mike kind of doesn't really take those things to heart, and so there's little pieces that fall and until the big fall.
What did you make of the relationship with Qantas? Because when I look at it, I think it was good in moments, but I think it was really destructive at other times. So what was it like unpacking that?
I think I mean I think there was real love there, and real caring, and I don't think Qantas is a bad guy, but I think that there was nobody to say, Mike, maybe we shouldn't be doing
right,
this.
Let's scale it back. Let's pump the brakes.
This is, like we've gone from having a couple of dogs to now having this dog fighting ring, and you are, an all-star quarterback. Let's not do this. And I just don't think that Quantis was the guy to do that. And I think that's was a problem.
I thought one of the great things in the film was just explaining dog fighting in Southern culture, because here up north, people don't really understand it. They think it's horrible. Why was it so important to do that, and why is it so fixated on in the South when it comes to dogfighting?
I think it was important for us to say that there's another way to look at this. How do you look at this? When we talked to Mike and Quantis and Pernell Peace, who was also part of the Bad News Kennels, they all said, well, we didn't think it was wrong. For I'm from New York City, and I'm like, what? How do you not know this is wrong? And so, I think it's important, as a filmmaker, to try to get into other people's heads, to understand that most people do stuff that for them is rational, and so for us it's like, how is that rational?
Right. Quantis says he wouldn't change anything either, which just boggles my mind, thinking about everything that's happened.
Right. No, I mean, Quantis has that great quote, where he says, look, if I could, I would do it again. Because it was that thrilling, But I think that they talk about the fact that growing up, they would see, guys in their neighborhood, fighting dogs, like impromptu dog fighting, and the police would just go by and wave and, wouldn't do anything. And so they felt that, in their purview, what they saw, that this was okay, whether that makes sense to us, who aren't exposed to it or not, it made sense to them. I think it's important that we talk about it.
I think it was really interesting to look back at the court case all these years later, because the coverage around it was crazy. I mean, it was almost thrown out multiple times, and then normal dogfighting charges weren't as long as Michael Vick got. So what was the craziest part about that chapter in his life to you?
Well, I mean, I think that very clearly that there were forces that wanted to make an example of Mike Vick, and they were very clear about that, and they did. Like before this, we didn't know that dogfighting was illegal.
Yeah.
You didn't know it, probably.
Right.
I didn't know it. Now we know. And that's what they wanted to do, and rightly or wrongly, Mike paid the price for that. People, I think, don't know that he was sentenced to 23 months in jail, which was more than the recommended sentence. They gave him more than was recommended. He went bankrupt. So in a lot of ways, he paid a very, very steep price for what happened.
Yeah, so he's in there for over 500 days. He files for bankruptcy. What was it like talking to him about those prison days, and what do you think changed in him during that time?
I mean, Mike says that, in some ways it was a blessing. I'm not sure if I believe that.
But he was going down such a dark place.
Yeah,
he was in a rough spot.
He was in a rough spot. He wasn't, studying his craft. He was into this dog fighting. He had these guys surrounding him. But at the same time, he had a family. And I think, it gave Mike a chance to really reflect on life. I mean, a lot of times, especially for athletes like Mike, who are constantly celebrated from grade school, and there's nothing to take. Nobody can pull you off that treadmill, because it's like you're wonderful, you're great, you're wonderful, you're great, and things come to you, and when you have that fall, you have a chance to think, about your life, and I think Mike really had that, and in some ways he really values that.
So he has the rock bottom of going to prison, but then he talks about that one day where Matt Ryan is picked by the Falcons, and then he can't go to his grandma's funeral, and that's really the lowest of the low points for him. And it's crazy now to think he wasn't even allowed to go to that. I mean, that's how bad things had gotten for him at that point.
Yeah, I mean, he was in Leavenworth. I mean, it wasn't like, he was...
Right, they're not just letting him out for the weekend. Yeah, Leavenworth's a real deal.
Yeah, he was in a real prison, with we talked to his roommate, in Leavenworth. He had a roommate, and he was in prison, and I think that low point really made, Mike reflect and say, okay, how can I come back, and not come back as a football player at first, but really come back as a human being.
Right.
How do I resurrect my life as a human?
I think there were a lot of really important people in helping Michael Vick resurrect his life. It starts with Tony Dungy. It took him months to get on the list to see Michael Vick. Why did he take such an interest in Vick, and how did he ultimately help Mike Vick?
Well, I mean, I think one of the things that Mike's team wanted to do, you know, his lawyer, and say, okay, well, you need to have some mentors and start talking to people, and who's better, you know, than Tony Dungy, who's really well respected, you know, as a coach, as a former player, but also as a human being in the NFL circles. And so, you know, just as you said, you know, when Mike says, you know, it took months to even get Tony Dungy in, you start to realize, you know, that he's really in prison. You know, like it's not like Tony Dungy can just walk in. It takes months to get him in there. But I think that was you know, the perfect person for Mike, you know, to start having some kind of mentorship and to start. Tony Dungy even says, you know, I didn't think Mike was ever going to play again.
Right.
I was going there to just help him out as a human being, because I didn't think that Mike was going to ever play again. And so, you know, Mike needed that kind of mentorship.
Yeah, you have to remember he was suspended at that point. You have Roger Goodell in the film, and Goodell says, like, he lied right to my face about this. But as ruthless as Roger Goodell can be, he can also be a forgiving commissioner. And what we saw with Vick was that he did forgive him because Vick was honest with him and really showed that he had done the work. So what was it like for you to hear the commissioner talk about that, and also for Goodell to give Michael Vick a second chance? I
mean, I think one thing about Mike, you know, and you see it in the film, you know, because you kind of wonder as a human being, you know, like why do these people keep forgiving Mike? But when you see him, he's like, he's just so honest about it, you know. I mean, it's not like, there's no way you don't believe him.
Right.
You know, you believe him. Now, you might not forgive him. You know, that's
but
your
he's
choice.
Being real and honest
but he's being real and honest about the fact that, you know, he now understands what he did was wrong and wants to do everything he can to make amends and to make it's in Mike's head. I want to make amends to animals, you know, because what I did was wrong. And I think, you know, Roger Goodell, to his credit, saw that. And was able to say, you know, okay, you know, I will reinstate you. I don't know if anybody's going to take you on any team, but, you know, I will reinstate you into the NFL.
Well, eventually he signs with the Philadelphia Eagles, and that relationship with Donovan McNabb goes all the way back to when he was deciding between Virginia Tech or Cuse. And without McNabb, I don't know if he signs with the Eagles. So why do you think McNabb ultimately was the one to push that through for Vick?
Well, you know, McNabb talks about the fact that he hosts Mike when Mike visits Syracuse, as Mike's trying to figure out what college to go to. So he knew Mike from when Mike was in high school, and you know, Donovan, you know, talks to Mike again, sees Mike's sincerity, and says, you know, Mike, if you're really willing to change, I'm willing to help you change, but you know, you're gonna have to rehabilitate yourself, you know, physically also, because you know, Mike was in prison for 2 years, and you know, when Mike was in prison, nobody knows why, but they closed the weight room, so he didn't even have a weight room in prison. So you know, he comes out, he's not in shape, and he has to get himself in shape. But he's also, you know, the third string quarterback,
right?
And that's, you know, as Mike says, you know, they call it the bum squad. You know, he's the third string. You know, with not, it wasn't like, okay, you're the third string and you're gonna work your way up. I mean, he is the third string quarterback.
You guys talked to Andy Reid also, and he had a son who eventually loses his life to drug overdose, but he had given people second chances, and he gave Michael Vick a second chance. So what was it like talking to Andy Reid, and what stuck out in that conversation? I
mean, you know, Andy Reid's just an incredible human being, and he took the chance on Michael. You know, he had one of his sons talk to Michael, and one of his sons said, you know, to me, this guy is sincere. You know, that's what I know, you know, from the life I've lived. And they give him a chance, you know. And again, you know, in some ways, it's low risk in football terms, you know, because he's the third string. But it's high risk because, you know, there was still this vitriol that's coming, you know, towards Mike. You know, people are still, you know, everywhere he goes, people are protesting and, you know, saying, how can you give this guy a second chance? But you know, to Andy Reid's credit, he did.
Yeah, and vitriol is one thing. It's another thing for that to happen in Philadelphia. That's a really passionate group of fans. So what was it like telling that part of the story where you're talking to people from Philadelphia and also reliving all the protesting that was going on for a guy who was a third string quarterback?
Yeah, I mean, you know, look, Philly is nuts. You know, it's a nutty football town, you know, and we wanted to show that a little bit, you know, in the film. I mean, when I say nuts, I mean in a great way. I mean, they take sports seriously. And there was a lot of protests when Mike was first signed. But as one guy says in the film, Mike slowly built this trust in Philly. Mike was talking to kids, talking to people, about animal abuse, and slowly but surely, that part of Mike was rehabilitated or built up, and he's still the third string quarterback. But there's this trust of Mike and what he now believes in.
It's pretty crazy because McNabb gets traded, Kevin Kolb becomes the starter, Kolb gets hurt in week 1, and then Vick's right there, and he's like, I don't know if I'm ready for this, and he was thrust in there, and then he ends up playing great for them. He gets a $100 million contract, which is hard to remember. He has that epic Monday night game. What was it like for him to relive that moment where he has 6 touchdowns against the Redskins? I
mean, in some ways, for Mike, that's the high point of his career.
Yeah, he says he was in the zone that night, right?
I mean, because, it was so, in so many ways, unexpected, and he gets the opportunity and takes advantage of it. And as people say in the film, he might be a better quarterback then than he was, in his heyday with Atlanta, because he's now studying the playbook. He's now looking to throw first, which you want from a quarterback. You can gain many more yards throwing the ball than you can running. So he's become a much more complete quarterback, and he takes real advantage of this second chance he has.
How would you evaluate how things are for him now, after football and just as a regular human?
I think things are great. I think that Mike has a family. He's working in football. He loves football, loves talking about football. He's still speaking out, against animal abuse. I think things are really good, but there is that certain, what if, that he has, he also, he spent almost 2 years in jail. So there's that piece, and that stays with you. So I think, all in all, he's doing great. I think, as he said, if he had kept on down the road he was going on, who knows where he would have ended up. So I think, all in all, he's in a real good place. Yeah, I mean, the guy was 1 game away from the Super Bowl. Again, that's hard to remember in this whole story. So what do you think people will focus on? Do you think they'll focus on the what-ifs with him, or all he went through in terms of his meteoric rise and also his downfall along the way? I think one of the great things about this story is people will focus on what they want to focus on, depending on who you are. There's some people who will say, oh, he's a dog killer and he's still a dog killer, and I still, he's still despicable. There's some people who will be understanding. There's a whole lot of people who love Mike Vick. We saw that. There's a lot of people, who still remember Mike and love him. So, I think however you come to the story, whatever you think, it's still just an amazing, story. Incredible story. It's just an incredible, story. And to see Mike Vick, play football is still, a real thrill. Yeah, it was breathtaking, no doubt. It's a great film, Stanley. Thanks a lot, man. Yeah, thank you. Really appreciate it. Check out Vick, Part 1 available right now. Part 2, Thursday. What's the date next Thursday? The 6th. February 6th. All right, for Stanley, I'm DJ. See you next time here on The Sit Down.